Okay, so here's where we're going to get into the weeds a little bit, talking about voice leading. And I hope that you enjoy my virtual background. I went to Bloomington yesterday, and this is some of the delightful fall colors from Monroe County. But soon I will move over to my camera and show you some other things. For right now, let me just talk a little bit about spacing and a little bit about doubling with the first inversion triads. First of all, you're not really going to be able to use open and close position the way that we've defined it thus far. With the kind of open and close position that I taught you, you were writing a chord and always, if you did it correctly, getting a complete triad in the upper voices. With the first inversion triads, you're often going to be doubling either the root of the chord or the fifth of the chord in the upper voices. So some different possibilities will emerge. For instance, you could have the alto and the soprano an octave apart, doubling either the root or the fifth. Or you could have the alto and the soprano in unison, again, doubling either the root or the fifth. Or you could have an octave between the alto and the tenor, or you could have the alto and the tenor in unison. It's also possible to double the third of the one chord, and if you're in a major key, to double the third of the four chord. So in that case, yes, you might have a complete triad in the upper voices, and you might use the standard open and close position voice leading. But your possibilities from this point on are going to rapidly expand. So it's very important that you really have the basics with the root position triads down. And it's also really important that you know how to check your voice leading and make sure that you have no parallel octaves, no direct octaves or direct fifths, contrary octaves or fifths, and so on. Okay, so you're going to have to pay super close attention to your chord spacing and your doubling, and to make sure that as you move from chord to chord, you don't have really bad part writing errors. Okay. Here's a little summary about doubling in first inversion triads. And this is going to hold true for all first inversion triads, not just the 1, 4, and 5 chord that we're learning about in this chapter. So this is something that you should definitely have in your notes, and you should come back to frequently. And you should really kind of commit it to memory. It's not very difficult to memorize. So first of all, the best scale degrees to double in all first inversion triads are scale degree 1, 2, 4, and 5. Do, re, fa, and sol. These are what we refer to as the tonal scale degrees, the ones that don't change between a parallel major and a parallel minor. So if you're in the key of C, for example, whether you're in C major or C minor, do is going to be C, re is going to be D, fa is going to be F, and sol is going to be G. So those should be your first choices to double. And there will be times when it may be convenient to double something else, but these should be your go-tos. Here are 2 more scale degrees that are okay to double. They're perfectly fine to double. Scale degree 3 can be doubled in both major and minor keys. So we can double both mi if we're in major and me if we're in a minor key. Now, scale degree 6 can be doubled only if we're in a major key. So it's okay to double la, but it's not okay in minor to double lay. One thing that I'll say is that these scale degrees are particularly common to double in the soprano and bass voices. So it's more likely that you will find a reason to double scale degree 3 in a 1/6 chord if it's in the soprano as well as in the bass. Now, these scale degrees are the ones that should never be doubled. And I took the extra step of putting never in red type. So please pay attention to that. Maybe I'll make it bold as well. You should never double the leading tone. Okay, so whether you're in a root position 5 chord or a first inversion 5 chord, or later if you're using the 7 diminished triad, the leading tone triad, never double the leading tone. The leading tone is too powerful. You don't want to have 2 of them in the same chord or the universe will explode. Well, maybe not quite, but what'll happen is that we will feel like the two leading tones both should resolve to tonic, and either we'll resolve them both to tonic, having parallel octaves, or we won't resolve one of them, leading to a frustrated leading tone. Okay, the other note that should not be doubled for the same reason is scale degree 6 in minor keys. Lay is an equally powerful tendency tone that wants to resolve down to sol. So again, you don't want to have two of those in a chord. Also, lay has a tendency to create augmented intervals. If we went from lay up to re, we would have an augmented fourth. If we went from lay up to ti, we would have an augmented second. So having two lays in a chord almost forces you either to have parallel octaves or to have an augmented interval. So here's a graphic summary of what I just told you. Here's your one triad. The one triad consists of do, mi, and sol. So the two notes that are best to double are do and sol, and I filled those in with red. The four chord is fa, la, do, or in minor it's fa, la, do, and the best notes to double are fa and do. And in the five chord, we have sol, ti, re, and the best notes to double are sol and re. So you see that what my doubling rule about wanting to double scale degrees 1, 2, 4, and 5 gives you is essentially the same rule that's in your book about it being best to double the root or the fifth of these chords, because scale degrees 1, 2, 4, and 5 are the roots and the fifths of the primary triads. Just to emphasize again, if you're in a minor key and you have a four chord, the third of that chord is lay, which is a tendency tone that wants to go down to sol. And in both major and minor, with the five chord, the third of the chord is ti, which wants to go up to do. So these chord tones are ones that you should not double. Don't double lay, don't double ti. So here are some 1/6 chords in the key of A minor. And I just want to show you examples of what I mentioned at the beginning of this lecture, noting that open and close position, the way that we've defined them so far in the class, will often not really be applicable to these first inversion chords. Okay, so here's a 1/6 chord with a very high soprano. A very good doubling here would be to double the fifth of the chord, which is sol, an octave below, and then have the root of the chord here. We don't have an incomplete chord. We do have all three notes, A, C, and E, and the E is doubled. And it's fine to have a gap of an octave between the soprano and the alto, but not more than that. Okay, another possibility would be to have an octave between the soprano and the tenor. So now we have A, E, A in the upper voices, and the third is supplied in the tenor. I'm going to put little brackets here to show what I've doubled. If the alto is very low, as it is here, we might want to double it at the unison and have the tenor supply the root of the chord. Here I showed you the soprano and the tenor doubling the root of the chord. Maybe here what I'll show you is the soprano and the alto a fourth apart, and the tenor doubling the fifth of the chord at the unison. Here with this very low soprano, in addition to doubling that note at the unison, it would be possible to have the A in the chord, and then in the tenor I could either have an A or I could go down and double the E below. Maybe I'll do that. And the last two I've shown you with the third of the chord in the bass and also the third of the chord in the soprano. We can do this either in a standard open position chord, where we have a sixth below the C and give the tenor the A. Or we could have it in close position, putting the chord tones as close to each other as possible. C, A, E4 is the next chord tone down, and there it is. It's not wrong if you double the third of a 1/6 chord in one of the inner voices. It's just a little bit less common. Okay, let's look at some short part writing examples here and see how this might play out in practice. I'm going to start with the arpeggiated prolongation of 1, where to fill in the skip from do down to may, we're stopping by lay on the way. Okay, so I'll start with that one chord in root position. And now I want to think about how to connect a 4/6 chord fairly closely with this chord. Now, again, lay is a note that we don't want to double. And if we double lay, one of the things that we may run into trouble with is having another do going down to lay and having parallel octaves with the bass. So don't do that. But let me keep the A as a common tone. And now I can either move the soprano up to the D, or I can move the soprano down to the A and have a unison there. I think either one will work fine. Let's try doing this. Okay, so you can see that I have parallel tenths in the bass. I have CA in the soprano, AF in the bass. And now the E, I'm just going to move to the closest member of the D minor triad, and that'll be the D. Okay, so we're doubling the 5th of the 4/6 chord, and that's a good note to double. I'm just going to keep the 2 A's here as a unison. Why move more than you have to? And the only motion that I would need then is to bring the D back to the E. Or maybe you don't like that. Maybe you'd like to have a little bit more motion. Perhaps you'd want to have the soprano A going back to the C. And in other words, we're just going back to our same chord. There are too many possibilities here with the doubling and with this spacing for me to give you some simple rules like, always do it this way, or here are some methods that we're going to call method number 1, method number 2, and method number 3. You just have to use your own intuition and your own good sense about how to move the upper voices. Let's now look at the 1 to 5/6 to 1 chord progression. I want to emphasize that when you have a T in the bass, because that's an outer voice where you can really hear it, the T in the bass must go to do. And what that means is that anytime you have a 5/6 chord, it's always going to go to 1. I guess the exception would be that if you had a 5/6 chord and it went down to a 5, but then we resolved to a 1. Okay, what's happening here is that 5 is being prolonged, and the G sharp is eventually going to the A, and so this is okay. But if you have a G sharp either in the bass or in the soprano, it either has to resolve directly to do or it has to eventually get to do. So be careful about that. I'm going to use an A in the soprano here, and I'm going to fill this in close position. And now with this A going down to G sharp, I'm going to move this A to B. So my octave is going in the opposite direction. And I'm going to keep the E as a common tone. So the 5th here, AE, is moving by oblique motion to a 6th. The octave AA is moving by contrary motion to a 10th. I approached this B from an A. I could go from the C up to the E and double the tenor and the alto on the same note, but I think it'll be a little smoother if I go to the B. And now, instead of going back to the same chord, I'm going to allow the soprano to continue going, A, B, C. I'm going to keep the A where it is, so we have a common tone all the way across. And I'm going to move the bass down, C, B, A. This is one of the chord progressions that I showed you in Lecture 2 in the textbook. Notice that in the tenor, we have passing motion. In the soprano, we have passing motion. In the bass, we have lower neighbor motion. And get this, we have a voice exchange between the alto and the tenor. You should know that I really love voice exchanges. So if you can put voice exchanges in your part writing, you're going to make me really happy, and I'm going to give you lots of points for it. So think about voice exchanges. Here's one more example. This is 5 passing through 4/6, going to 5/6. And then the 5/6, of course, is resolving to 1. So this is an example of passing motion. in the bass. Just as is true with the root position chords, anytime you're going from 5 to 4 or from 4 to 5, you really have to avoid parallels, and I think the parallel fifths are going to be particularly difficult here. So keep in mind that the 4 chord has fa, do, and the 5 chord has sol, re. And you want to be sure not to have those 2 fifths in the same pair of voices, or you'll have parallel fifths. Interestingly, it is fine to have a perfect fourth from do up to fa, and then to have it move to another perfect fourth, re, sol, by parallel motion. So one of the things that you can do is you can always try to get yourself this perfect fourth in the 4 chord, because that'll help save you from the parallel perfect fifths. Okay, so I'm actually going to do this right away. I'm going to put do, fa in 2 of the upper voices of the 4 chord. So that would be an A and a D. Okay, now I don't have to worry about moving into a perfect fifth by parallel motion. If I have parallel motion, it's going to be just fine. I'm going to start the 5 chord in open position. I could move down to the A. I'm a little bit worried about painting myself into a corner. You know, the A is going to have to go up. It can't go down and be below the bass. So I think I'm going to move my tenor to the D. I think that's going to give me a little bit more flexibility. So I'm doubling the D by the octave. I have the leading tone. So what I need to have in the 5/6 chord is another E, another B, and then one more of either one of those notes. Okay, I don't want my A to go down to G sharp. That would be a double leading tone, so I'm going to carefully move the A up to the B. Okay, and I'll move the D up to the E. Okay, and now because I have a D down here, I absolutely don't want to move it up to an E. That would be parallel octaves. The D can't go to the G sharp. That would be an augmented fourth, or if I leap down, it's a weird leap, and besides, we don't want to have 2 G sharps. So that means that this D has to go to the B. And notice here, as I said, I have parallel perfect fourth intervals, and that's perfectly okay. I'm going to put a little smiley face there because parallel perfect fourths are good. So those are a few part writing tips. I can't show you a comprehensive list of all of the possibilities. That would simply take too long. But this will get you started, and we'll be working on part writing in class on Monday. Thanks. Enjoy your weekend.